They say a gilded cage is still a cage, but I often found mine felt more like a perfectly chilled glass display case. I was, after 12 years, the museum piece. I am Clara Sterling, CEO's wife. My role was not to live, but to present, to be the quiet, beautifully polished surface reflecting Rex Sterling's immense, glittering success. Our penthouse was 45 floors above Central Park West, a breathtaking monument to his ambition. Yet for me, the view was always secondary to the precise ritual required to manage the man who owned it. My day began at 5:30 a.m., not by choice, but by the refrigerator's low hum and the soft, efficient click of the elevator down the hall. I'd glide into the kitchen, a silhouette in a silk robe I'd long since realized made me feel less glamorous and more like a tool he'd purchased. The coffee, exactly 1 heaping scoop of the rare Ethiopian yirgacheffe, a specific pinch of cardamom because his mother insisted it, aided focus, and 2 drops of vanilla. While the machine gurgled its morning prayer, I was at the ironing board. The dry cleaner never got the collars right, too soft, too loose, and Rex, a man who commanded the attention of global markets, would notice. It was a small detail, but in our world, details were indictments. I'd press the steam button, watching the first weak stripe of sunrise slide over the reservoir, thinking I was trying to smooth out the day before it had a chance to wrinkle us both. I'd lay out his vitamins in the silver dish, a wedding gift from a forgotten aunt. Omega, 3D magnesium. Lately, I found myself counting them twice, just to keep my hands moving and my mind from settling on the quiet dread that lived in the back of my throat. There was a time when his first sip of coffee, the tiny, appreciative hush he'd make, felt like a shared victory. Now it was just a score I was expected to keep, never missing a point. Rex would stride in, already checking his phone before his eyes met mine. His kiss was always delivered to the air near my cheek, a gesture so detached it felt transactional. Dinner tonight, he'd announce, not ask. Morrison Capital. You know the players, right? I'd nod. Always. That was my skill. The invisible labor. I memorized the wives' passions, gardening, abstract expressionism, hating red meat, and the husband's soft spots, sailing stories, rare single malts. I was a walking, breathing social database, ensuring no awkward silence ever spoiled Rex's carefully curated atmosphere. His response landing like a tiny, stinging paper cut. Good girl. By 3 in the afternoon, I was at the salon. My hairdresser, bless her, knew the drill. Approachable elegance, which meant soft waves that wouldn't move even if the market crashed. I had the guest list spread across my lap, noting that Richard Morrison loved stories about his new yacht, the Resolution. I had to know them all, because my ability to save a social moment was the only currency I held. My old college friend, Chloe, called. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to explain why I was always busy doing nothing substantial. The manicurist offered a bright, brave red or a safe, soft pink. I chose the pink. It matched everything and said nothing. Standing in my closet, surrounded by clothes Rex had approved. The navy suit, the charcoal dress. I ran my fingers over the emerald silk gown I loved. Green makes you look like you're trying too hard. His voice echoed in my head. I zipped the navy. I practiced my smile in the full-length mirror. Not too wide, not too small. The expression of a woman who is expected to be the room's temperature, never the storm. The venue was the St. Regis dining room, polished mahogany, low light, truffle oil scent thick in the air. The wives clustered, trading war stories about contractors and summer Hamptons rentals. I took my usual post, a familiar weight of Rex's hand on the small of my back. a possessive anchor. That's when the shift happened. She arrived not as a guest, but as a casual declaration. Piper Vance, young, sleek, her dress whispering promises as she moved. She didn't seek a chair. She slid into the sliver of space between Rex and me with casual, practiced ownership. "There you are, see," she cooed, touching his forearm as if the fabric belonged to her. The table went quiet. "That nickname, see," delivered with that soft, proprietary giggle, was the first bomb of the night and had landed squarely in my marriage. My stomach churned, a sudden, cold certainty settling in the pit of my gut, a feeling I hadn't prepared for, yet somehow recognized instantly. I realized right then that I was not just being introduced to a new consultant. I was being introduced to my replacement. The evening was about to become very long, and my polite facade was dangerously close to shattering. I felt the crystal glass near my elbow tremble, and I knew it was reflecting the slight tremor in my own hand, a tremor that I absolutely could not allow Rex to see. The performance, I knew, had just been upgraded to a high-stakes emergency, and I was dangerously low on prepared material. The crystal near my elbow did more than tremble. It started to hum with the sound of my rising adrenaline. I'd spent 12 years being the perfect silent partner, but tonight silence felt less like grace and more like surrender. Rex's smile stayed pinned for the table, but his eyes, when they darted to mine, were cold steel. "Who told you you could make a scene tonight?" he hissed across the white linen, his tone laced with menace, even as the waiter swept past with the silver domes of the appetizer. On his right, Piper, with her diamond drop earrings and her polished, soft giggle, pressed 2 fingers to his sleeve. "Relax, Rexy," she murmured, using the nickname again, a private secret I hadn't agreed to. She's only teasing. Rexy. The sheer, ridiculous intimacy of it made my blood run cold. I didn't start the day expecting to be humiliated at a table that cost more than my entire first year of college. I tried to be gracious, professional. "Welcome, Piper. What brought you to New York? How long have you been in strategy?" I asked, forcing a light, interested tone. She answered like a person who loves being asked questions more than answering them, weaving a vague narrative of synergy and disruption. The board members noticed, but the wives noticed everything. Then came the knife twist. She titled her head, her smile predatory. "Do you still get that beautiful eastern light in the master bedroom, Clara? You're so lucky. The guest room view is lovely, too, of course." My napkin slipped onto the Persian rug. I hadn't mentioned our floor plan to anyone. I told myself she was just overeager, trying to fit in quickly. I tried to excuse the familiarity as youth, the expensive perfume that smelled like grapefruit and ambition. But then she went on, admiring the Monet print in the study, the one Rex bought to project importance, and describing the morning view from our terrace as if she'd watched the Fifth Avenue traffic lights blur into threads of color. It takes a simple sentence to tilt an entire room, and she delivered a monologue. Rex laughed, a boardroom sound that can turn a no into a maybe. Piper, without missing a beat, leaned across him, her knuckles grazing his tie, and retied the knot. "You did it again, see," she said, chiding him like an errant child. It was a gesture too small, too easy, and too sure of itself. I heard my own voice before I had a plan for the words. "Do you do that often?" I asked, my eyes on her hands, the tone light, curious. The table went silent, the way people do when they sense a fire before they smell the smoke. "Clara," Rex said, using my name like a warning, not a welcome. I didn't back down. "I'm curious," I added, keeping the lightness. Is tie straightening part of the consulting package? Or is that one of the premium services? A cough, a fork clinking too hard against the china. The wives busied themselves buttering invisible bread. The men considered their wine glasses. Piper's smile cooled, but she recovered quickly. We're all family here, right, see? Enough, Piper, Rex cut in, through a fixed smile aimed at the chairman opposite him. He reached under the table and pinched the inside of my arm. Not hard, not enough to leave a mark, just a painful reminder. Years ago, I might have laughed it off. Tonight, the pinch felt like a termination memo I hadn't signed. The conversation resumed in careful, fractured pieces, like everyone had agreed to skip the embarrassing paragraph. To steady myself, I thought of our 5th anniversary in Paris, the way he looked at me coming down the hotel staircase, the way I believed that looking at me would always feel like that. Tonight, the memory felt like a rope burn rubbing raw. Dessert arrived, a delicate thing with spun sugar that caught the light. Piper lifted her phone, snapped a photo of the plate, then turned the camera for a quick selfie with Rex in the background. Caption, she murmured, winning. I set down my spoon. The moment had arrived. Do you have a pet name for my husband, Piper? I asked gently. Or does he only use Rexy for you in private? My voice wasn't loud, but it traveled. Rex's smile died first, then his jaw locked. Surprise flashed, then rage, then something flat and final I recognized from the days he fired people over breakfast. Clara, he said low, we will discuss your behavior later. The words didn't belong to our marriage. They belonged to his corner office. I nodded. Of course, I said. Make sure to put it on the calendar. I'd hate to be accused of missing a meeting. The car ride home was silent. Rex typed furiously on his phone. Piper's perfume, citrus and bite, still clung to his jacket. Back at the penthouse, he stormed straight to his study, leaving the door slightly ajar, a clear signal that he wasn't hiding, just actively unavailable. When he finally emerged, tie loosened where Piper's fingers had been. His face was the sterile mask he wore for the cameras when he had to talk about business losses. We'll address your little outburst, he said. In due time. I met his eyes, feeling a strange stillness. It wasn't peace. It was the wide, waiting space before an answer. He looked at me then, eyes flat, mouth tight. You've been reckless, petty. Until you can conduct yourself appropriately, you'll stay in the guest room. The words were so sterile, so detached, I nearly laughed. He might as well have been talking about a business partner who missed a deadline. I just said, okay. He blinked, thrown off by my compliance. You'll stay there until you apologize to me and to Piper. That demand almost broke my silence. To her? To the woman who knew the view from our master bedroom? My tongue stayed still. I swallowed the metallic taste of the unspoken retort. Okay, I repeated softly. He narrowed his eyes, waiting for the familiar collapse, the tears, the plea. I gave him none of it. He muttered something about ungrateful, turned his back, and walked toward the master bedroom, closing the door behind him with a small, definitive click. I stood in the hallway, holding my grandmother's coat, realizing that silence had become our most fluent language. The air between us was too heavy to breathe. The chandelier's reflection gleamed on the marble floor, and in that moment I understood. The life I'd been living had just pressed pause, and the pause felt like a beginning. The exile he had ordered was about to become my great escape. I turned, not toward his closed door, but toward the one he thought held my punishment. The guest room door creaked when I pushed it open. He'd intended it as a place of banishment, a solitary confinement, but the space smelled faintly of lavender and furniture polish, utterly untouched by his presence. It was clean, quiet, and profoundly neutral. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, realizing with a sharp, sweet jolt of clarity that this was the first time in 12 years I had entered a room in my own home without needing to ask, "Will he mind?" I carried only a pillow, a thin blanket, and my phone. The bed was smaller, the mattress firmer than the king-sized monstrosity next door, which had been chosen for its CO-approved lumbar support. I sat down on the edge and let my shoulders drop. The silence here wasn't lonely. It was foreign, yes, but not empty. I could hear the real city through the cracked window, a distant siren somewhere on the Hudson, the rhythmic click of a crosswalk signal, the low, vital hum of engines below. Rex's industrial-grade white noise machine, which he used to drown out reality, wasn't here. Here I could listen. I lay back, still fully clothed, and stared the ceiling. The faint glow of the hallway chandelier leaked under the door, casting a soft halo on the far wall. Then I reached for the lamp on the side table and switched it on, just because I could. It felt like an act of defiant, luxurious rebellion. Next to the lamp, there was a small stack of forgotten literature, a copy of an Elena Ferrante novel I'd bought months ago and never dared to open after Rex said reading before bed made me too distracted. I picked it up. The pages whispered as I turned them, a sound far sweeter than the rustle of divorce papers. I read until my eyes burned, until around 3 a.m. when the city finally started to quiet down. I wandered into the guest bathroom. This room, tucked away for occasional visitors, had always felt like a forgotten corner of the house. Hidden in the back of the medicine cabinet was an old electric kettle, the kind visitors use for late-night chamomile. I filled it with tap water and waited for it to hum, watching the steam curl upward, ghostly and light. I poured the tea into a small, chipped mug that said Barnard Alumni, one I'd kept tucked behind the fancy china because Rex hated mismatched things. The first sip was bitter, too strong, but it tasted exactly like freedom. I caught my reflection in the mirror, hair coming loose, makeup smudged, eyes a little red from lack of sleep. But there was something new there, too. Not beauty, not even a defiant strength. Just me, stripped of the performance. I'd forgotten what that looked like. It wasn't until I crawled back into the small bed, pulling the thin blanket over my shoulders, that I realized I was falling asleep without waiting for someone else's breathing to dictate mine. When I opened my eyes at dawn, the light on the ceiling was softer, warmer than the filtered glow in the master suite. It fell across an antique writing desk beneath the window, my grandmother's desk, the one she'd left me. Rex had tucked it in here, calling it too rustic for the main areas. Dust shimmered on its scarred surface. After a shower, I sat down at it with a pen and a pad of crisp white stationery from some forgotten hotel. I began writing without thinking. At first, it was a list of small things, my practice, my friends, my name. Then larger, heavier things, my choices, my time, my peace. Each word felt like the careful, slow drag of extracting a deep, painful thorn. My handwriting started neat, proper, but soon loosened, becoming bolder, more urgent as the ink began to flow. I wrote about the charity events, the weekends spent smiling at people who only ever addressed me as Mrs. Sterling. I wrote about the dozen dinners where I laughed at jokes I didn't find funny because I could feel Rex watching my reaction, grading my compliance. By the time I paused, 2 pages were filled. My chest ached, yes, but it was the ache of air returning after too long spent underwater. In the bottom drawer of the desk, tucked beneath some old textbooks, I found my antique leather address book. I flipped through names I hadn't seen in years. College friends, old clients, my former yoga instructor. And then between 2 pages, a business card slipped out. Margaret Winters, attorney at law. Her handwriting on the back was small and neat. Just in case you ever wake up. I remembered that charity auction 6 years ago. Her steady, firm handshake, the sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through my polite, carefully constructed facade. I hadn't known then what she meant, but I did now. I placed the card in front of me and stared, the way you stare at a locked door when you suddenly realize you know exactly where the key is. The decision felt immense, terrifying, and utterly necessary. The pause was over. The game had begun, and for the first time I was dictating the rules. At 6:30 a.m., 3 precise, efficient raps shattered the quiet of the guest room. Rex always knocked like that, short, sharp, demanding. "Clara, are you awake?" His voice filtered through the door, smooth but tight with contained irritation. I didn't answer right away. I finished applying my lipstick in the mirror, a vibrant berry shade I hadn't worn in years, capped the tube, and set it on the desk. My reflection looked strangely competent for a woman who'd just been demoted in her own home. The lipstick was a tiny, silent declaration. I was already out of uniform. The door creaked open halfway. Rex stood there, still in his sleep shirt, jaw freshly shaven, irritation already simmering behind his eyes. "Have you learned your lesson?" he demanded. I turned slowly, holding the chipped Barnard mug in both hands. The strong scent of my bitter tea filled the small room. "Lesson?" I asked evenly. "You'll have to be specific." He stepped inside, crossing his arms, his posture signaling immediate dominance. "Don't start. You humiliated me. You're lucky I'm being patient." I glanced pointedly at my watch. "Patience," I repeated softly. "That's what we're calling it now." He frowned, clearly unused to this version of me. His eyes flicked over my outfit. A fitted slate suit, low heels, my hair pulled back, not approachable elegance, but streamlined purpose. "Why are you dressed like that? You're not going anywhere." "I have appointments," I said. "What appointments?" "Important ones," I replied. The simplicity of it seemed to genuinely unsettle him. He searched my face for some hint of weakness, for the familiar apology, but there was nothing left for him to find. I was no longer an open book for him to annotate. I brushed past him, my shoulder grazing his arm, and headed for the kitchen. "Clara, don't be ridiculous," he called, following me halfway down the hall. I slipped my travel mug into my designer tote, the one I'd chosen, not the one he'd gifted. "Good advice, Rex," I said, keeping my voice gentle, dangerously gentle. "You should try it." He stopped, caught between genuine anger and complete confusion. "You think you can just ignore me?" "I think," I said, pressing the call button for the elevator, "you'll be surprised by how much I can do." The elevator doors closed before he could reply. As the numbers dropped, I leaned back against the polished steel, feeling my heartbeat slow to something steady, something deliberate. The reflection staring back at me looked calm, almost serene. I didn't know exactly where I was going first, but for the first time in 12 years, every single step would be somewhere of my own choosing. When the elevator chimed at the lobby, I stepped out into the cool morning air of Manhattan. Thomas, our veteran doorman, nodded politely, utterly unaware that the woman passing him in a perfectly tailored gray suit wasn't Mrs. Sterling anymore. Not yet, but soon. The city had a different texture now, sharp, electric, alive. Every step away from that penthouse felt like crossing an invisible, yet intensely real, border. I found myself standing in front of a cold glass tower on Lexington Avenue, 42 floors of polished ambition. Margaret Winter's office. The nameplate outside her suite gleamed gold, understated but commanding. I pressed the intercom and heard her assistant's crisp voice. "Miss Hayes, Miss Winters is expecting you." The office smelled faintly of rich leather and old paper, the particular scent of places where people negotiate lives and redraw boundaries. Margaret stood behind a desk that seemed to stretch the width of a small stage. She was exactly as I remembered: tailored navy suit, pearl studs, posture like a ruler. Her eyes, however, were warmer than I expected. "You woke up," she said simply. "I did," I replied, and handed her the folder of notes, the 2 pages I'd filled at my grandmother's desk, 17 pages of dates, conversations, receipts. 12 years of passive observation distilled into actionable evidence. She skimmed quickly, marking passages with a red pen, the sound of the ink scratching like tiny, quiet verdicts. Every few minutes, she murmured something under her breath. Classic diversionary spending, patterned control behavior, possible misuse of marital assets. When I mentioned that Rex had once tried to hire her firm years ago for a merger, her brow lifted. "Oh, he did more than try," she said, opening a drawer. "He wanted me to represent him, but I declined. Conflict of ethics, you could say." She reached into a cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled Sterling R. She slid it across the desk with quiet satisfaction. "I've been keeping this. Something told me you might need it." Inside were copies of financial disclosures from years past, public filings, corporate transfers, and even shell company data. Margaret leaned back. "Men like your husband always think they invented secrecy," she said, her voice carrying no judgment, just precision. "But they forget secrecy leaves clear footprints, especially when it comes with a platinum Amex." I found myself breathing easier, as if someone had just switched on the lights in a room I didn't realize was dark. By the time we finished, she had a solid plan. "We'll start with documentation. Financial, personal property. Everything in your maiden name. And everything he's hidden. Do not alert him yet. And Clara," her gaze softened, "don't confuse quiet with weakness. Silence can be strategic." I left her office feeling steady, upright, no longer small. 2 days later, I walked into the Chase private client office on Park Avenue. It was a place I'd visited only once before, always at Rex's side, a silent accessory. The receptionist greeted me with a cautious smile. "Mrs. Sterling." I hesitated, then said, "Miss Hayes." They led me to an office overlooking the manicured green of Park Avenue, where a manager named Patricia introduced herself. She was in her late 50s, silver streaks in her practical bun, eyes sharp but kind. "You said you needed statements." 3 years, I said. "Everything." She nodded and began typing. Within minutes, the printer hummed to life, spitting out page after page, each one a tiny, crucial piece of a massive puzzle I hadn't known existed. I flipped through the sheets, and my stomach twisted. High-end jewelry purchases from Tiffany's, always dated around my birthday, none of which I'd received. Hotel charges at the St. Regis, the Carlyle, the Plaza, always during his so-called conferences. Then, tucked among the generic business expenses, a line that made me freeze, the shock hitting me not as an explosion, but as a deep, controlled, terrifying chill. I stared at the amount, a significant figure, steady, monthly, hidden under the catch-all category of wellness. I felt Patricia watching me. She didn't ask questions, but her silence was the kind that understands too much. "There's more," she said gently, sliding a printed sheet toward me. "ATM withdrawals. Always Tuesday afternoons. Cash exact, round amounts. It's patterned." I hadn't noticed. I had been too busy managing his calendar, his dinners, his public smile. The tears came then, quiet but unstoppable. They weren't tears of grief for the marriage, but for the sheer systemic deception, for the 12 years of my own blind obedience. Patricia, wordlessly, slid a box of tissues across the desk. "You're not the first woman to come in here with this look," she said softly, "but you might be one of the few who walks out stronger." I wiped my eyes and exhaled, the sound a low, shaky whisper. "I need new accounts," I said, my voice steadying. "Ones he can't touch. All under my maiden name, Clara Hayes." She smiled approvingly. "Let's make that happen." We set up everything. New passwords, new security phrases, new credit cards, new beginnings disguised as routine banking tasks. When I left, Patricia handed me a clean folder. "Keep this safe," she said. "And remember, money tells the truth. People won't." The feeling of that folder under my arm was immense. It wasn't the relief of escape. It was the power of knowledge. I was no longer operating on suspicion, but on documented forensic fact. I had a paper trail. I had my name back. And most importantly, I finally had the numbers that proved Rex saw me not as a partner, but as an expensive inconvenience. That night, I slept in my hotel room. Not the one Rex had intended for me, but the one I had booked using my new card, and the sleep was deep, undisturbed by the need to prepare for another man's dawn. I had transitioned from being a liability to an architect, and the silence of the night was the sound of my own strategy unfolding. My next phase involved an inventory of Rex's most prized possession, his wine collection. I returned to the penthouse during his work hours, arranging for the sommelier to appraise the cellar. The air inside the apartment smelled faintly of cedar, polish, and Rex's expensive cologne, the remnants of a man who equated ownership with permanence. Julian, the sommelier, arrived precisely at noon, a tall, silver-haired man with the quiet authority that comes from decades spent among bottles older than both of us combined. "Mr. Sterling requested I appraise the collection last year," he said, setting up his clipboard. I raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware." He chuckled, a dry, knowing sound. "They rarely tell the wives, Miss Hayes. But I'm glad it's you I'm working with today." We moved through the temperature-controlled cellar together. Julian read off the labels like sacred verses. Chateau Margaux, Petrus, Lafayette, Rothschild. Then he paused at one empty slot. "Ah, the 1982 Margaux. Beautiful case. Delivered to a Tribeca address last month." I froze, the air in the cellar suddenly too cold. "Tribeca?" "Yes, for what Mr. Sterling described as a client event," Julian said. He glanced up, his expression neutral, but his eyes confirming my worst suspicion. Though I recall that address belonging to a luxury residential building, not an office. He didn't elaborate further, but the unspoken words hung in the climate-controlled air like condensation. The bottle of wine, valued at close to $50,000, was not a business expense. It was a very expensive housewarming gift for a young woman in Tribeca. By the time Julian finished, the collection's worth was staggering. He meticulously photographed each label, documenting everything. Before leaving, he handed me a copy of the list. "You'll want this," he said, giving me a sorrowful smile. In my experience, the wife usually gets the collection in the end. Men who cheat, he added, always underestimate the inventory. That evening, as I waited in the lobby for a delivery receipt signature, Thomas, the doorman, spotted me. "Evening, Miss Hayes." He paused, uncertain, then smiled softly. "I always liked that name better." He hesitated, glancing toward the empty elevator bank before lowering his voice. "I've been keeping something for you, Miss Hayes." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, black spiral notebook. The cover was creased, the corners bent from use. "I started this about a year ago," he murmured. "Didn't feel right what I was seeing. Thought you might need it someday." Inside were neat, handwritten notes organized like a security log. Dates times little details. Tuesdays, 11:30 p.m. Mr. S. returned with young blonde. Not Mrs. S. Delivered flowers to Lobby B for a Piper Vance, no card. Left 6 a.m. Said emergency meeting. My throat tightened, a sudden, fierce lump of emotion. "Thomas, why?" He rubbed the back of his neck, awkwardly. "Ma'am, you were always kind. You'd ask about my grandson when nobody else remembered his name. I figured if things ever went wrong up there, you'd need someone who saw it all, but kept their mouth shut for the right person." I closed the notebook gently. "Thank you," I said, the words feeling too small, too inadequate to carry the weight of his loyalty. He smiled faintly. "Just glad to see you standing taller these days, Miss Hayes." I clutched the notebook to my chest. For years, I had thought that silence was the only way to keep the peace, but silence had only kept me invisible. Now every truth I uncovered, every ally who emerged, felt like a brick in the foundation of something new, something that was finally and truly mine. Rex had controlled the money, the image, and the narrative, but I had unexpectedly cultivated the loyalty of the people who saw his reality, not his projection. As I stepped outside, the city wind swept across my face, cool, alive, and honest. I was ready to use the inventory. The temporary phone Margaret had provided glowed in my hand with a message from Rick, the discreet relocations expert. Confirmed floor plan received. Question marks tagged in pink. I replied with photos of 3 items I'd forgotten to mark: my father's first edition books, a quilt my mother made for our wedding, and a brass watering can Rex had mocked, but I used every summer. Monica, Rick's partner, replied with a thumbs-up emoji. The operation was set for Thursday morning. Rex would be at his weekly racquetball game like clockwork. Wednesday began with a precise click of the key in my temporary apartment lock. "Honey," my mother, Eleanor, called, stepping into the foyer with that brisk, comforting scent of Chanel No. 5 she'd worn forever. She found me at the small dining table, surrounded by piles of financial statements, the floor plan, and a tangle of charging cords. Her eyes traveled over the organized mess, then settled back on me. "Well," she said, her lips curving into a proud smile. "There she is, the girl who used to organize her dollhouse by tax bracket. I knew you had a plan." "I don't know if I'm brave or foolish," I admitted, my voice tight. "Both," she said, stepping forward to hug me firmly. "That's how change starts. You look alive, Clara." We made tea. I used the proper porcelain mugs this time, not the chipped Barnard one, the familiar ritual soothing my hands. I told her everything: the bank accounts, the wine collection, the shocking details from Thomas's notebook. Her mouth thinned with a quiet, fierce rage that she didn't need to spell out. "I started keeping things too," she said, reaching into her structured leather tote. She laid out a neat stack, printed photos from galas, Rex in the background with Piper's hand on his sleeve, Screenshots from Piper's social media pages where she appeared in more of Rex's vacation spots than made sense, and restaurant receipts from family dinners he swore he'd attended. On top of the stack was a small, fabric-covered journal. Every time you called and said you were fine but sounded like you'd been crying, I wrote down the date, she explained. I didn't want to push you, Clara. I wanted proof for when you decided you deserved better. Something in my chest gave way. Not a collapse, but the sudden, freeing feeling of a door opening in a house with stuck hinges. I should have told you sooner, I whispered. You told me in the spaces between your words, she said softly. Then she opened her checkbook. The sound was crisp, decisive. She wrote a number, a significant, six-figure sum that made my breath catch, and slid the check across the table toward me. From your father's policy, she said, her voice steady. I kept it for you. I always knew there would come a day I'd hand you this and say, go start fresh. So go. I stared at the check. It represented practical things, retainers, apartment deposits, rooms with locks, but more than that, it felt like profound permission. It was the ultimate vote of confidence from the one person whose opinion truly mattered. Rex's money had always been a chain. This money was a foundation. I tucked it deep into my bag. Will you be okay? I asked her, holding her hands. Yes, she said, and I realized I believed her completely. Before she left, she stood in the doorway and looked back at me, a proud glint in her eyes. When you see him trying to scare you into staying small, remember who raised you, Clara. He doesn't get to define your courage. After she was gone, the apartment felt different, not emptier, but lighter. At noon, I met my cousin Derek in a quiet hotel lounge. Derek worked security for the Ritz-Carlton downtown. He slid a flash drive onto a cocktail napkin and tapped it once with his finger. You didn't get this from me, he murmured. Of course not, I said. Weekend of the Miami conference, he said. Check-in video, elevator lobby. Also 3 other unscheduled visits. He grimaced. The concierge keeps copies of all receipts. I pulled what I could without raising flags. And you're sure? I asked, turning the drive over in my fingers. Clara, he said gently, I wouldn't have called if I wasn't sure. She's wearing your Cartier bracelet in the clip from the elevator, the one with the tiny emerald clasp. A cold current ran through me, not shock, but the grim certainty of confirmation. Thank you, Derek. Sorry you had to learn it this way, he said. Sorry there was a way, I replied. He reached across and squeezed my hand. You were always the one who wrote things down, he said, grinning. You're still that person. The evidence didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a necessary tool. Monica texted that evening, route confirmed. Thomas on nights. Flower van staged. Groceries at 0700. I typed back one word, utterly calm. Ready. Groceries delivered. The text message glowed on my phone in the quiet, pre-dawn light of the Carlisle suite. I sat up. The fear was still there, a useful, alert hum beneath the surface, but it no longer ran the show. Calm slid over me like a well-fitted coat. I dressed in my simple slate suit, flats for speed, hair pulled back. The doorman nodded when I passed the desk as if we shared a quiet secret. I hailed a cab for the 5-minute ride home. Walking would have given me too much time to think. Thomas was on post when I stepped into the lobby. Good morning, Miss Hayes, he said, his voice low. His eyes flicked toward the curb. Parked. There was a van lettered Anderson's Flowers in cheerful, completely unthreatening script. 2 men in dark windbreakers were unloading tall buckets with nothing but foam inside. A third wheeled in a stack of flat boxes tied with twine. He left 10 minutes ago, Thomas added. Lucky Polo looked very pleased with himself. Thank you, I said, the words carrying everything: gratitude, resolve, the knowledge that after today I would owe fewer explanations and more dinners and thanks. Monica appeared by the male alcove, all business, ponytail and clipboard. Morning, she said, as if we were meeting for coffee. Elevator A is timed. We'll stage first loads in the service corridor. You go up now, regular car, no stops. We're on your schedule, not his. Upstairs, the guest room was exactly as I'd left it. I walked to the master bedroom and stood at the window. At 6:45 a.m., right on cue, Rex's Tesla slid from the garage. Even from above, I knew the set of his shoulders, the pep in his posture when he believed the day belonged to him. He paused at the curb to adjust his wristband, checked his reflection in the tinted glass, and drove off toward the financial district. I lifted my coffee mug in a small toast to his taillights and whispered, Godspeed, as if blessing a ship that wouldn't be returning to this dock. The first coded ping arrived, vases on table. I opened the front door. 2 movers in dark jackets slipped past me without a word, rolling a dolly as if it held roses, not bubble wrap. Rick followed with a quiet nod, then peeled off toward the dining room. The apartment filled with the soft, industrious orchestra of careful people. Tape whispered, cardboard settled. Footsteps avoided the squeaks in the aged hardwood. In the kitchen, a young mover named Luis held up a photo I hadn't marked. A small, faded picture of my parents on a Ferris wheel. Faces turned to the sun. Take, he asked, his tone neutral and gentle. Take, I said. He smiled, slid it into a thin folder, and made a small check mark on his list. That single act felt like a quiet blessing. Monica texted from the lobby, hydrangeas leaving. First run done. I moved through the rooms with Rick at my shoulder. China first, he said. Breakables early while nerves are fresh. He lifted the lid of my grandmother's china cabinet as if it were a hymn book. The team wrapped each plate in bubble sleeves, labeling in neat block letters. Haste China, box 3 of 9. Watching those gloved hands cradle the delicate pieces, I felt an odd mixture of heartbreak and pride, like seeing a part of my history finally protected. In the study, 2 movers donned cotton gloves to handle my father's first editions. Spine up, one murmured to the other. They slid thin sheets between covers and stacked them in museum crates that locked with a soft, final click. I brushed my fingertip along the worn title of a copy of The Great Gatsby and said, mostly to myself, My father read me the first page like a bedtime story. The mover nodded without looking up. Mine read crime novels, he said. Seems appropriate today. We shared a quick, strained smile. Another ping. Window box herbs collected. I pictured the little terracotta pots on the terrace, the stubborn cherry tomato vine I coaxed through August. Rex used to call them your little farm. The team had found the brass watering canned, too. Monica sent a photo with a question mark. I typed back, yes. Pack. We were 3 hours into the ballet when I opened the master closet and saw the floor safe. It crouched behind suits lined up like silent, judgmental soldiers. My mouth went dry, not from fear, but from the weight of what comes when you finally choose to look. I knelt, entered the combination, our wedding date, of course, and the bolt slid back with a small, obedient sigh. Passports, birth certificates, insurance policies, the will. I laid each item on the carpet and photographed them with my new phone. Then I found the thing I'd almost forgotten existed. The prenup. Thick, officious, smug on cream paper. Margaret had already told me it would crumble under daylight, but I took photos anyway. Every page, every signature. Behind it, bundled in a ribbon so dry it cracked, were my letters, the ones I wrote him when marriage still felt like a new country. He hadn't opened them. Dust marked the edges like a quiet, 12-year-long verdict. And there, in a small velvet box pushed to the back, I found my grandmother's emerald ring. Rex had once shrugged and said, "It must have been misplaced in the move." Misplaced had been his tidy word for so many things that didn't suit him. I lifted the ring out, the stone catching the morning light, and slipped it onto my finger. It settled as if it had been waiting for me to reclaim it. The emerald ring felt heavy and right on my finger, a sudden, solid weight of history and ownership. It wasn't a fragile, modern diamond. It was a deep, dark green that felt like earth and resolve. It had belonged to a woman who ran a business in the 1950s, a woman who knew the value of a firm contract and a sharp eye. I was suddenly aware that Rex hadn't misplaced it. He had hidden it, because it carried a strength he couldn't control. Monica pinged. Lily's refreshed. Second wave. I could hear the faint, soft, organized movement of the movers in the distance, working with the quiet efficiency of professional thieves. Except they were stealing back a life, not money. I placed the useless prenup back in the safe. Let him look at it and remember how certain he'd been that he could control my future. I took the passports, the birth certificates, the emerald ring, and my father's pocket watch, tucking them securely into my crossbody bag. I closed the safe, spun the dial to an unfamiliar number, my grandmother's birthday, and felt my spine lengthen with the finality of the act. Then a small snag. The housekeeper, Alma, arrived with a laundry basket on her arm. She paused in the entry, her eyes widening at the flower boxes and the tape. "Señora," she whispered, her brow furrowing with alarm. "It's okay, Alma," I said softly, stepping close. "Today is a special kind of cleaning." She looked at me for a long second, her eyes reading more than I was saying. Then she squared her shoulders, her posture shifting from housekeeper to guardian. "I make sure no one bothers," she said, and took up a post by the door like a silent sentinel. I pressed a wad of cash into her hand, and she shook her head, but then tucked it away without looking. "You were always kind," she murmured, and the sentence warmed me for the next hour. I realized that my kindness, dismissed as weakness by Rex, was the one asset he couldn't touch. At noon, Rick checked his watch. "Halfway," he said. "We're ahead." He pointed to a small gallery wall in the hall. These? They were photographs from places I'd loved before I learned to pretend. Coney Island in winter, a tiny bookstore in Rome, a rainy corner in Dublin where a busker played the violin. "Take," I said. A mover with gentle hands eased each frame from its hook, wrapped it in foam, and numbered the backs. I caught my reflection in the glass as it went into the protective sleeve. Hair neat, eyes clear. I didn't look like a runaway. I looked like a woman who had read the plan twice and remembered all the exits. Another ping, peonies arranged. Third wave leaving. Monica added, "Doorman offers umbrella." Rain starting. I smiled, picturing Thomas outside, handing out plastic sleeves to imaginary blossoms. I stood in the master bathroom and looked at the tray of expensive perfume bottles I never wore for myself. Gifts chosen for their names. Authority, Victory Muse. I chose one I'd bought years ago and tucked away because Rex had said sandalwood didn't suit me. I dabbed it at my wrist. The scent bloomed warm, clean, quiet confidence instead of announcement. By 3 p.m., the apartment had edges I'd never seen without my things. The The spaces where I'd been obedient were obvious. The kitchen, once staged for entertaining, looked like a showroom. The study felt like a stale set for a man performing competence. The only room that still hummed with something true was the guest room, where my grandmother's desk sat under the window. Dinner ready at 15:30. Monica's final text. Almost complete, Rick confirmed. We leave the furniture he'll trip over with his own ego. The rest is yours. My documents next, I said. I carried a slim box to Rex's great mahogany desk and opened it. Inside were the divorce papers, the ink still dark where the clerk had stamped them. I added the forensic accounting report, tabbed, highlighted, and merciless. It was open to the neat page that traced company funds into Piper Vance's paycheck, as if it were a cake recipe. Finally, a small, square piece of cardstock I'd had printed at a tiny shop on Lexington. 6 words set in bold, black type, centered perfectly. Nothing more. I stepped into his study at exactly 4 p.m. The room had that expensive stillness that would get in the late afternoon. I arranged the documents. Divorce papers on the left, fanned so the case number and the stamp seal were easy to see. The forensic report on the right, the red tab peeking like a discreet flag. My little card centered on top. I took out my phone and photographed the desk once, then twice, then a third time from the doorway. Not for spite, for record, for memory, for the moment my life changed because I decided it would. I stood a while longer listening. The movers were gone. The flower van was now a room or 2 blocks away. The only sounds were the low hum of the refrigerator and a distant siren. I went room to room, sliding open a drawer here, closing a cabinet there, saying quiet goodbyes not to the things, but to the version of myself who had kept them dusted. At the door, I tucked Thomas's notebook deeper into my bag, adjusted the emerald ring on my finger, and turned off the lights. The elevator arrived with a soft ding. The doors closed, sealing away the echo of the life I'd chosen to leave. I was back in my quiet, temporary suite at the Carlisle when the storm broke. I was drinking peppermint tea, the warmth sitting on my tongue like a small, private victory. Upstairs, my shoes made soft sounds on the plush carpet. The silence of the suite was absolute. Downstairs at the penthouse, the silence was shattered. I heard the story later, pieced together from Thomas and Margaret, but in the moment I could only picture it. Rex's key in the lock, the confident stride, the immediate pause. Then the frantic chaos. Closet doors opening, drawers sliding, hangers clattering. The realization that the vast, silent wealth was still there, but the support system, the clothes, the notes, the woman was gone. Then came the stillness, the kind of silence that announces understanding. The first word reached me via an irritated text to my old number, which I'd left on the kitchen counter. "Clara, what the hell is this?" He found me minutes later. The door to the guest room burst open with the drama of a courtroom. Rex filled the frame, his tie askew, his face the color of bad news. The meticulous precision he wore like armor at board meetings was gone. His eyes were bloodshot, the careful polish cracked through. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice lower than I expected, ragged around the edges. "Where are your things? What have you done?" I set my cup down carefully on its saucer. "I've relocated," I said. He blinked, disoriented by my calm. "Relocated? Don't play games, Clara. Where is everything? Where is our property?" "Mostly in storage," I said, folding the edge of a paper on the desk beside me. "Somewhere, climate-controlled. You'll be glad to know." He stared, chest rising and falling, his hands flexing uselessly at his sides. You can't just take. I can, I said evenly. And I did. Every item was legally acquired during our marriage. Every removal properly documented. He took a step closer, lowering his voice to that dangerous, controlled tone he used when a deal was slipping through his fingers. You think you can humiliate me like this? Do you have any idea what this looks like? To my colleagues? To Morrison? Yes, I said, meeting his gaze. Like accountability. For a moment, he looked almost frightened, then angry again. You've lost your mind. You've gone completely irrational. I stood and smoothed my jacket. Irrational. I echoed. Rex, I've executed a strategic restructuring of personal assets. You should appreciate the phrasing. You taught it to me. He frowned. This isn't a negotiation, Clara. This is a disaster. Not for me. You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it. I'll have every lawyer in the city on retainer by morning. I tilted my head. You might want to save that retainer money for your criminal defense fund, I suggested. He froze mid-step. What's that supposed to mean? Before I could answer, my phone lit up on the desk. Margaret's name flashed across the screen. Perfect timing. I picked it up and tapped speaker. Clara! Margaret's voice came through, smooth and sharp. I assume you're with him. Rex moved closer, his posture shifting into his CEO stance. That false confidence he wears like cologne. Margaret, he said, cutting in. Whatever nonsense my wife has told you. I'm not your employee, Rex, she interrupted, her voice steel. And she's not your wife much longer. I'm calling to inform you that we've submitted evidence of embezzlement to the board. His mouth fell open slightly. That's absurd. Charges will be reviewed Monday, Margaret continued, unbothered. We have documentation tracing acquisition funds into a personal account in Piper Vance's name. I believe you used the label consulting fees. Care to clarify? The color drained from his face so fast it was almost theatrical. Those were business expenses, he stammered. She was under contract. Then you'll have no problem producing deliverables, correct? Margaret's tone was almost kind. The board looks forward to seeing them. He grabbed the phone from my hand. Margaret, listen. She cut him off with the precision of a surgeon. I've been listening to you for years, Rex. Now it's your turn. You should know there are witnesses, too. The CFO, for instance. And we've already arranged for a forensic review of your company card. There's no negotiating out of this. He stood perfectly still, breathing hard, when she hung up. The silence came back, thick as smoke. He handed me the phone with a trembling hand. You think this makes you the hero, he said. You've destroyed everything. My reputation. My company. No, I said quietly. You did that. I just made sure someone finally noticed. He turned away, one hand pressed to his temple, the other clutching the edge of the desk. You don't understand what you've done. You can't walk away from this. You owe me. I laughed once, slow and sharp. Oh, you. He faced me again, eyes wild. Yes, every success I built, you benefited from. You lived in this penthouse, wore the clothes, went to the dinners. You think you can rewrite history now. I'm not rewriting anything, I said. I'm finishing the last chapter. He sank into the chair behind him. You can't mean to go through with this. You can't humiliate me like this. It's not humiliation, I said. It's consequence. I paused at the doorway, the city lights glittering faintly behind him. Reasonable was staying quiet while you erase me, I said. Reasonable was pretending not to see what everyone else already knew. But unreasonable finally got me here. He looked up, eyes wet now, the anger dissolving into something closer to desperation. Please, Clara, be reasonable. I adjusted my grandmother's cashmere coat on my arm and looked him squarely in the eye. You told me once that marriage is about managing assets, I said. You were right. I just didn't realize I was one of them. I stepped into the hallway, closed the door gently, and let the latch click. The sound was clean, final, a full stop at the end of a sentence I'd been writing for 12 years. The 3 days following the confrontation felt strangely quiet, the eye of the storm. The city hummed with its usual indifferent energy, but Rex's world was imploding in muffled conference calls and emergency board meetings. I stayed in my Carlisle suite, reading Ferrante and feeling the steady, cool weight of the emerald ring on my finger. On Tuesday morning, I was halfway through my tea when the urgent, uneven knock of someone panicking rattled my suite door. I opened it to find Piper Vance standing there. Mascara-streaked, hair limp, a designer bag clutched to her chest like a life raft. Please, she said before I could speak. He's being horrible. I didn't know where else to go. I stepped back and let her in. She hovered by the window, eyes darting everywhere, the picture of expensive panic. He cut off my accounts, she said, her voice thin and shaking. Said I violated some agreement. He made me sign an NDA months ago, and now he's threatening to sue me if I talk. Her voice cracked. He said it's my fault this happened. He said you're vindictive, that you turned everyone against him. Sit down, Piper, I instructed, gesturing toward the comfortable gray armchair by the window. She fumbled for a tissue. He promised me, she whispered, the panic giving way to sheer disbelief. He said he was leaving you in January. He even showed me houses in Connecticut. He said we'd be partners. I studied her face, the panic, the shock that someone could be both charming and cruel. It was a look I knew well. He's turning on you now because you're no longer useful, I said gently. She swallowed hard. Do you hate me? I considered the question, truly considered it. I did, I said, finally, for a while. But hate gives him too much credit. You were just another part of his collection, Piper. A much more expensive version of a new tie. A tear slid down her cheek. I thought I was special. So did I said. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain against the window. Then I reached into my purse, pulled out a business card, and slid it across the table. Margaret Winters. She looked down at it, confusion flickering into realization. You're giving me your lawyer? She's good at cleaning up after men like Rex, I said. Call her. Tell her everything. She'll negotiate the NDA and protect you from his threats. Her shoulders sagged, some of the frantic terror leaving her face. I don't deserve your kindness. This isn't kindness, I said softly. It's closure. I won't have Rex leaving loose ends, and I won't have you suffer for the simple mistake of believing him. When she left, she paused at the door. For what it's worth, she said, he's terrified of you now. Good, said. He should be. The next visitor came the following morning, announced by the crisp, authoritative knock of someone who doesn't wait to be invited. I opened the door to find Eleanor Sterling, Rex's mother, standing in a perfect camel coat, pearls at her throat, eyes cool and assessing. Mrs. Sterling, I began. Eleanor, she corrected, stepping inside. We're well past the formalities, don't you think? She didn't sit. She reached into her structured handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder. I didn't come to apologize for him, she said, though heaven knows someone should. She handed me the folder. Inside were photocopies of old court records, settlement documents, names I didn't recognize. "What is this?" I asked. "His past," she said simply. "The parts he didn't bother to erase." I scanned the pages. Divorce papers from the first marriage he claimed was annulled. Notes from an HR department about a harassment claim settled quietly. A second, less formal payment labeled consultant exit fee. "I kept them," Eleanor said, sitting finally. Her voice had softened, but her posture stayed upright, spine like iron. I told myself it was for protection, but I think I just couldn't bear to throw away the evidence of who my son really was. I looked up at her. "Why are you giving them to me?" "Because you're the only one who ever stood up to him," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "And because you're about to be the one who finally holds him accountable." A strange mix of regret and relief washed over her face. "His father was charming," she continued. "He could talk his way through anything. But Rex? He inherited the ambition without the grace. I raised him to think success made him safe. It didn't." She stood, smoothed her coat. "I don't expect forgiveness, Clara, but I am sorry. For you. For the damage he's done." Before I could speak, she stepped forward and surprised me with a hug. Brief, firm, almost motherly. "I always hoped you'd be the one to stop him," she whispered near my ear. When she left, the folder sat on my lap like a small, heavy truth. The two strongest women in Rex's life had just transferred their allegiance to me, not out of malice, but out of a shared, desperate need for the toxic chapter of his life to end. Friday's mediation was held at the penthouse. It felt surreal walking back through those doors, the familiar space stripped of all intimacy. The art gleamed without warmth. The furniture posed for a life that no longer fit anyone. Rex was already there, sitting beside his lawyer, his suit looking too large, the tie loose, the shine completely gone from his custom shoes. I took my place across the table, Margaret on one side, the mediator at the head. The process began with the dry language of ending. Asset lists, valuations, percentages. Rex tried to argue for sentimental items, paintings he'd never noticed, sculptures he'd dismissed as dust collectors. "That painting," he said, gesturing toward the fake Monet print, "was part of our shared aesthetic." Margaret smiled, cool and professional. "You mean the one you said clashed with the color of your desk?" His lawyer shifted uncomfortably. We moved on. Rex tried to claim my grandmother's dining set, citing historical value. I produced an email he'd written 2 years ago, calling it "Old Garbage We Should Donate to Goodwill." Rex leaned back, jaw tightening. "You've turned everything into evidence." "No," I said quietly. "You did that when you made everything transactional." The mediator cleared his throat. "Let's stay civil." We did, barely. Every object carried a memory, and every claim was another small severing. At one point, his attorney asked about a photo album, our honeymoon in Italy. I looked at it. Worn edges, smiling faces from a lifetime ago. "You can keep it," I said. "Those people don't exist anymore." For the first time all morning, Rex looked at me, not the papers. There was something raw in his expression. Remorse, maybe, or just the recognition that the performance was finally, irreversibly over. When the final signatures were placed, the mediator gathered the folders. "That concludes the division," he said. I stood, smoothing my jacket. The penthouse felt smaller now, the air thinner. As I turned toward the door, I caught a glimpse of the study down the hall. Empty desk, the faint outline where my stack of documents had rested. Rex's voice followed, soft, uncertain. "Clara, I paused but didn't look back. "Take care of yourself, Rex," I said. "You're going to need it." And then I left him there, surrounded by the fragments of the empire he'd built and broken with his own hands. 3 months later, I stood in a different hallway, the downtown courthouse, wearing the emerald dress Rex always disliked. The fabric skimmed my knees, bright against the beige tile and scuffed baseboards that had seen more endings than a library. Margaret stood beside me, reading glasses low on her nose, a shield of papers tucked under her arm. When the clerk called my case, we walked into the courtroom. The judge was a woman with silver hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun. She looked at the documents, then at me. "Miss Hayes," she said, the name rolling out as if it had never been anything else. "Are you ready to finalize?" "I am," I said, clear and sure. The decree restored my name, my property, my quiet. When the judge stamped the final page, the sound echoed like a soft gavel against my bones. She looked up and gave me the smallest smile, the kind professionals share with people who have survived the hard part. "Congratulations," she said. "May this be a beginning." Outside, Margaret hugged me in the corridor. "We didn't just win," she said in my ear. "We closed the book." A week later, I signed a lease on a small office on the Upper West Side. Second floor, sunlight that flattered no one and hid nothing. I peeled the protective film off the door plaque and pressed on the letters myself. Clara Hayes, LW Consultation. I'd put my license in a frame years ago and tucked it away because a wife didn't need such things, or so I'd been told. Now it hung at eye level. The room smelled like fresh paint and pure possibility. I chose chairs that invited conversation instead of performance, a round rug that warmed the floor, a bookshelf that held more than decor. My receptionist's desk stayed small by choice. No gatekeepers here, just a woman with kind eyes named Tessa, who baked lemon bars for nervous clients and remembered how everyone took their tea. My first client was a woman in a navy coat who kept her hands folded until they ached. She had seen my name in the society pages, Rex's fall made for a story people read with coffee and a shake of the head, and she wanted help leaving a man whose voice lived in her own bones. She sat in the gray chair, stared at the rug's pattern, and asked the question I knew would come. "How did you know you were ready?" "I didn't," I told her, my voice low and honest. "I just knew I wasn't willing to stay." We talked until the tightness in her jaw softened. When she left, she pressed my hands in gratitude and whispered, "I'll be back next week." She was, and so were others, women who knew private schools and private pain, women who needed a plan more than sympathy. I built binders with tabs and phone trees and resource lists. We practiced hard conversations in my office until they sounded like truths instead of apologies. Around month 6 of my new life, a pale green envelope arrived at my office with no return address. Inside was a card with a watercolor tree on the front. The handwriting surprised me. Rounded letters, hopeful and young. "Clara," it began, "I wanted you to know I'm okay. I'm in Vermont, running a small yoga studio. Turns out I'm better at breathing than branding. Thank you for the wake-up call, even if you didn't mean it for me." There was a photo tucked into the fold. Piper Vance in leggings and a sweater, hair in a messy bun, cheeks flushed, standing under a wooden sign that said Mountain Breath Yoga. Next to her, a bearded man in flannel held a mug, his smile quiet. On the back of the photo, she'd written, "His name is Jake. He reads poetry. He has never owned a suit. I think that's the point." I didn't write back. I didn't need to. I set the card on the bookshelf beside a small carved bird my mother found at a flea market. When a client later told me she felt ashamed for not seeing a pattern sooner, I thought of Piper's face and said, "We see things when we're ready, not before." Spring arrived in fits and starts, sunny Tuesdays and stubborn Thursdays. The day of my book launch, I woke before the alarm, excitement ticking in my body like a friendly metronome. We titled it The Guest Room Revolution, a phrase that made Margaret grin the first time she heard it. The publisher booked the ballroom at the St. Regis, the same hotel where Rex had introduced me to Piper, and I said yes without hesitation. Irony, when used correctly, can be a healing spice. The lobby smelled like lilies and coffee. Tessa fussed over the name tags and the glow of the floor lamps, then pressed a peppermint into my hand. "Tape for nerves," she said. People began to arrive, women with bright eyes and careful smiles, a few men in the back taking notes for sisters and friends. My mother entered on the arm of Thomas, the doorman, who wore a suit that fit like it had been waiting for a reason. He waved the smallest wave and mouthed, "Proud." I squeezed his fingers and said, "You clean up well, Thomas." Even Eleanor Sterling appeared, standing near the back, her expression unreadable until I caught the small, affirmative nod that said, "More than flowers would have." When it was time, I stepped onto the stage. The mic felt warm in my hand. I read a passage about the first night in the guest room, about the odd freedom of a lamp left on and a window cracked open to real air. The audience was still, the kind of stillness that means people are holding their breath. When I finished, I set the book down and opened the floor for questions. A woman with gray hair in a pink cardigan stood up. "Do you regret anything?" she asked. The room waited. I thought of the years, the dinners, the practice smiles. I thought of the night I said, "Okay, to the guest room," and meant, "Watch me." I shook my head. "I regret not moving to the guest room sooner," I said. "That's where I learned the lesson I should have learned earlier. That comfort can be a cage if you let someone else lock the door." Applause rose like heat. I let it rest there. Then I read the dedication. To all the women who were told to learn their lesson, and did. I signed books afterward. A nurse told me she'd put a deposit down on her own apartment that morning. A teacher said she'd saved my article about documentation as a checklist. A woman about my age squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you for showing me that the person in the mirror can change." That night, back at my quiet, well-organized apartment on the Upper West Side, I climbed the stairs and paused at the threshold of the room I had chosen to use as my office, my own permanent guest room. Through the glass, the city glowed, a soft, improbable green. I opened the window a few inches and breathed in the mild night air. The scent of damp leaves, a hint of street food, a stray note from a saxophone somewhere down the avenue. On the dresser, my grandmother's emerald ring caught a line of streetlight and threw it back in a small, satisfied wink. I turned off the lamp, slid beneath the sheet, and listened, not for someone else's footsteps or breath, but for the city and for my own quiet heart keeping time. I slept without bracing. In the morning, sunlight poured across the floor in that clean way it does when a day hasn't yet been complicated by anyone's expectations. I walked to the kitchen, made coffee the way I like it, and set 2 plates on the counter for pancakes because my mother would arrive with a newspaper and opinions. I caught my reflection in the microwave door, hair messy, eyes bright, mouth ready to smile, and felt the gentle certainty again. The person who controls the boardroom isn't always the one who controls the board. Sometimes it's the one who owns the building. And sometimes the best takeover is the one where you take back your own life, one room at a time, until the whole place belongs to you. This story, The Guest Room Revolution, isn't just about divorce and dazzling corporate takedowns. It's about timing. It's about recognizing the difference between waiting for permission and gathering your strength. For the older members of our community, those who feel trapped by decades of habit or obligation, I hope Clara's story proves that the pause, the moment of exile, can become your greatest asset. Your kindness, your attention to detail, the loyalty you earned from those around you, are all resources Rex Sterling never saw. They are the true foundation for your next act. You don't need to be a billionaire to conduct a strategic exit. You just need a plan, a good lawyer, and the conviction that your own peace is non-negotiable. What was the most shocking or satisfying moment for you? Was it Thomas's quiet loyalty, the emerald ring, or Margaret's phone call? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this journey of reinvention and sweet, sweet consequence. If you believe every woman deserves to choose her own color and write her own ending, hit subscribe and share this story. You never know whose life you might be saving.